with artists and writers and filmmakers whose work is all inspired by topics relating to systems change. And here at Systems Change Alliance, we see that the arts are a really important tool for social change, because they've always been used as a way of inviting transformation, revealing truths, crossing boundaries, and raising awareness. And for all those reasons, and the fact that they're just linked to our ancient cultural human traditions, we see them as playing an important role in this movement of systems change that we are hoping to bring more and more people and organizations to. So joining me this evening, or this morning in New Zealand, is Alina Siegfried, who is a writer and poet, and I'm going to tell you more about her. Welcome, Alina. Thanks so much for taking time to be here. So Alina Siegfried is a storyteller, a narrative strategist, systems thinker, spoken word artist, and mother of two, who's passionate about creative communications and the use of storytelling to progress systems change. She performs spoken word under the alias Ali Jax, and can often be found espousing thought-provoking messages from behind the safety of stage lights and a microphone. In 2012, Alina won the New Zealand National Poetry Slam and went on to compete in the 2013 Women of the World Poetry Slam in Minneapolis. She's currently drawing on her diverse career across government, social enterprise, conservation, resource management, NGO campaigning, and the arts to write a book on storytelling and narrative to support systems change. The book is due to be published next year, early 2021, and you can sign up for updates on her website, alinasiegfried.com. So thanks, Alina, for joining us from all the way across the oceans, New Zealand. And I wanted to invite you to share a piece of your spoken word work with us, if you'd be so graceful.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for having me. It's fantastic to connect with other people who are passionate about systems change. So yes, it'd be my pleasure to perform a poem for you this morning, and then we can talk a little bit about my work. All right, so I'm just going to rock into this poem. If we are to believe the stories that dominate our newsfeed, there are an evil group of people out there who are out to destroy our lives. They do not share our values. They have no common sense. They will take away your freedom, bombard you with fake news, brainwashing your children with their propaganda. They will do everything in their power to take away all that you hold sacred. Beware. They are out there, the people we call them. Them, the enemy. Them, those other ones. Them, the ones we must overcome, the target of every comment section everywhere. So confident are we that we are the ones who are right. We have turned respectful public debate into millions of miniature individual dictatorships of the mind. The teeth of our savage sound bites grows ever sharper by the day, while indignant ears grow deaf to anything that does not reinforce our worldview. There is no room for reason in a lynch mob. No longer a gift in give and take. No space for complexity in a 280 character tweet. The air is growing thin in this here echo chamber. It's getting harder and harder to breathe. We need not even look too far before we can identify a them. Even amongst brothers and sisters in arms, sibling rivalry cuts deep. The climate activists might question the urgency of queer rights if we have no habitable planet to call our home. The unionist challenges foreign aid when a working wage can't even feed our own people. We hear it's the immigrants who are the problem. No, the people in SUVs. No, it's the dairy farmers, the greenies, the feminists, the TERFs, the bankers, the church, the NRA. It's corporate welfare, guerrilla warfare. It's the liberal media, the gay agenda. It's them, it's they, it's those people. If only they would stop. Can you hear that? That is the sound of singular stories. That is the sound of petty distractions. It is the sound of red herrings gasping for breath as the future slips away. Oblivious to our own hypocrisy and wasting our precious energy, we are setting ourselves on fire in the hopes that they will die of smoke inhalation. It need not be this way. We can be better than this. We have the cure for them. It's simple. It is us. What if we took our pointing fingers and we turned them upside down to extend the gentle hand of compromise? Embraced our grace and offered up our gifts with humility, embracing grace and humility. That's not to say that we should ignore the wounds from the past, deny the role of privilege, or cease to pursue our passion for change. After all, even the Buddha taught non-violence, not pacifism. But let us dismantle systems of oppression without creating carbon copies addressed to them. Step away from the militancy you have held so close as a lover. Soften your heart and walk a mile in shoes that do not fit. Shoes that cause you discomfort, blisters edging their way in beneath the soles of the feet you have so firmly planted into the arguments you've convinced yourself are solid. This place is comfortable, it is familiar, but we desperately need to stand upon common ground. For it is there that we can pinpoint the underlying causes beneath our addiction to outrage. Feelings of pain and grief, of losing that which we hold dear. Feelings of fear of those who we do not understand. Feelings of pain, of leaning into the despair of not knowing how the hell we are going to dig ourselves out of this mess. Respect the collective wisdom that comes from listening to many voices that are different from your own. Find your passion and then you do you and do it well, while simultaneously seeking to understand and respect why it is that they care so differently about something else. According to particle physics, we exchange 98% of the atoms in our bodies with the world around us every year. So I am you, and you are me, and they are us, and we are them. We are them. We are them. To somebody, somewhere, you are them. Thank you.
Thanks, Alina. That was powerful and, yeah, very raw at times. I'd really be so interested to know about the process you go through in order to craft a piece like that. Would you tell us a little bit about the creative process behind your performance work? Sure.
I mean, it always starts for me with a concept, something that's been on my mind. And obviously in the case of this poem, it's the increasing polarization and division that we see across the world. So it starts with an idea, and then usually if I've decided I'm going to write a poem about it, I'll start jotting down some notes. I'll have a first crack at writing some things down. It always evolves over the course of a few weeks for me, usually. It's very rare that I sit down and write a poem and I'm like, yep, that's it. So I generally print it out, actually, whatever notes that I've got, and I carry them around with me. And I find that, you know, now that I'm thinking about this, I'll have little moments of inspiration all over the place. And I've got that printed out poem with me, and I'll just make some notes on it and scribble. I'm quite a visceral person when it comes to actually writing and scribbling on things. So it does, yeah, it just doesn't work the same for me. If I had it in digital format and was adding to it, I need to be able to chop and change and actually get a red pen out and mark it up. And then
Yeah, I can relate.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say I can relate to that kind of physical act and the paper and the the scribbling. It sort of it's completes the process, doesn't it? Of just it's not just a cognitive.
It does. There's something about that sort of the getting into the somatic act of feeling it and feeling the paper and there's I'm the same with checklists. Actually, I have to write out my to-do list because it just feels so good to cross things off.
And it's all about that act of creation, isn't it, of taking something that is pure consciousness and manifesting it in a physical form. What is it that you love about the medium of spoken word, particularly because it's quite different from written poetry that sits on a page?
Yes, it is. For me, I love the ability of it to say something quite powerful in a minimal amount of words, really. So that's true of all poetry. Is that you can capture the spirit of something, the emotion of something. You can capture something that's bigger than the sum of the words. But for me, spoken word is really about experiencing a poem in the way that the person who wrote it intended it to be heard. So for me, poetry on the page is a very limited experience because I think words are only one small part of a poem. For me, I want to be able to hear how the voice sounds, what the tone is like, how quickly the person is talking or how loudly, and to see gesture and eye contact and facial expression and so on as well. Those are all parts of it. So for me, it's like the words are just one stripped out little piece of a poem. Much like how we often try to solve problems without thinking about the whole system that's within it, right? As the poem is just one, the words of the poem are just one little piece of a whole system of a poem.
Yeah, and the more I explore spoken word, it feels like it's melding different genres. It feels like it brings in that ancient oral tradition of storytelling. It's also kind of monologue or theatre, or sometimes with multiple voices, as well as poetry itself. It's really an amazing art form. How did you what inspires your poetry day to day? Who and what is an inspiration for you?
That's a good question because it changes. Probably the trend in my more recent years has been quite big sort of worldly issues that are shared by a number of different people. So looking at things like polarization or climate change or things that we can feel a shared experience in. So it has a universal appeal. Earlier in my sort of spoken word career, I wrote quite a few more poems that were much more personal to me. And I still try to weave that in. I try to weave in some sort of an element of how it, even if I'm speaking about climate change or some sort of other big issue that affects a lot of people, I do try to weave in a personal element to it because that is what engages people and takes it from being an abstract problem to a real thing being experienced by real people. It's a fine line to walk because I really don't want to make my poems all about me. But it certainly has morphed over the last 10 years from being quite personal to much more broad picture themes.
Yeah, I've noticed how you bring your own experience into the picture, and I think it's really effective because, like you say, people need to identify with, they need to see themselves in that big picture message writers, so it's all about how they relate. And yeah, I think a lot of artists tend to focus on the personal, to find it seems to be the minority who address the bigger social, economic, environmental questions. And it'd be amazing to see more of that. Do you work with other artists, or do you share what you do?
I haven't to date. We did attempt to do a collaborative poem during lockdown with another spoken word artist, Sian Marie, who's here in New Zealand, is an incredible poet. But we didn't quite make it work. I mean, the lockdown, as people around the world will know, has been sort of quite stressful for a lot of people, and has been a very unsettling, strange time. So, I mean, we've been incredibly lucky here in New Zealand in that we've only had one full nationwide lockdown for about 6 weeks, and otherwise we're doing really well in the coronavirus stakes. But in terms of other collaborative poems, I've done things where I've provided a couple of lines to a poem, something like that. We did do a collaborative coronavirus poem with a small press called Muse Pie Press, and they collected, I think it was something like 260 different lines from different poets, and put them together into a poem without adding anything else into it. So that was a fun project to be part of. But for my participation, it was just sending off an email with a couple of lines. So it is something I'd love to explore in the future, is collaborating with other poets as well as with musicians.
Yes, I've seen a few spoken word artists who bring kind of musical elements into their work, and it's really great to experience. Yeah. Was there a turning point at which you started to address more social issues? Do you remember any particular time that changed?
Well, it didn't change for me, because that's how it started at the beginning, and it was a really eye-opening moment for me when I first discovered that I really enjoy this spoken word thing, because I had been going to the poetry nights for a little while in Canada, thought it was quite interesting, and at the same time I had been working for an environmental NGO over in Saskatchewan, Canada, and my focus of my role was on water policy and freshwater issues in the province. And I had put myself onto this quite extreme water conservation challenge for a month, where I decided I was only going to allow myself 25 litres of water per day to meet all my daily needs. So that includes your cooking, laundry, bathing, flushing the toilet, everything that you need water for. I would only have 25 litres a day, which is not a lot of water. It's about, I don't know, this much cubed. It's a very small amount of water. I think at the time the average Canadian was using 230 litres per day, and in the States it was well over 300. So I did that poem, and during that same month I decided I was going to enter my first poetry slam, which is the competitive format of spoken word poetry. And I wrote a poem about my experiences with this water conservation challenge. And I mean, it largely is my story of that month, but also weaves in some themes around global water politics and the corporatization of water resources and so on. And so I wove that in, and so that was the first spoken word sort of performance piece I ever presented, and it was fascinating, because for weeks and weeks and months afterwards, people were coming to me up to me at that same poetry event, or even sometimes just on the street when they'd see me, and they were telling me about these ways that they were saving water now, after hearing the poem. And it was an epiphany for me that I managed in 3 minutes to put across a message that I was otherwise trying to do in these long, boring PowerPoint presentations with my work. And I'd struck a chord with that creative medium, and with 3 minutes, and people were remembering it and actually taking action because of it months later. And that to me just felt so incredibly powerful, that I thought, okay, this is what I'm doing, and this is the way that I can reach people. And so it really did start out from being quite an active encouraging behaviour change or social and environmental change messaging right from the start.
Yeah, that's such a great story of how an artistic medium can convey something in such a more urgent way than a boring PowerPoint presentation, as you put it. I watched, because you've done a TED talk on telling about that experience, haven't you? And I watched that recently. And I have to say, when I turn my back on a running tap, I think of you, I think of your poem, and
Right.
it kind of jolts me into like, okay, that's not a good, not a good idea.
Yeah, and
so
it's the same.
really
It's the same
worked.
story that that opens my book, because it's just such a powerful, very real, measurable thing that I experienced. Is it was just such an eye-opening moment that really changed the trajectory of my life and career.
So was it from that point on that you started to explore storytelling and narrative, or was that already in your work prior to that?
Yeah, good question. It was adjacent to my work, absolutely. So in my work of campaigning on protecting fresh water, there was certainly a big communications component to it, and particularly communications for social change or environmental change. From there, I went back to New Zealand and actually worked for 3 years in parliamentary service, so doing environmental issues campaigning for members of parliament over here. And that certainly had a storytelling element to it, but was also quite wrapped up in political campaign framing style storytelling and communications as well. So yeah, it was probably early 2014 or mid 2014 that I took on a job that really basically was grounded in storytelling, and from there I've just incorporated it more and more into my work, and my poetry has increasingly infiltrated my professional career, which has been quite funny. It sort of started out as this fun hobby, and I remember calling my mum and telling her that whole poetry thing had like landed me a real job, because it was as part of the interview for a job I got with an organisation that would become the Edmund Hillary Fellowship in New Zealand. The founders of the company actually said, we want you to bring the spoken word and those kind of style of communications into this organisation and into our communications. And so from there, I had the chance to be able to perform at conferences more and that sort of thing as part of my other job, which is an absolutely privileged position to be in for somebody who's in the arts, as many artists will understand.
Yeah, that's great. And New Zealand's a pretty exciting place to be right now, I feel, with the political potential that has taken place with Jacinda Ardern and then the recent election, right? How does it feel to be in a country where you feel like you can be behind the status quo rather than against it?
It makes me feel I feel an immense amount of gratitude around that, and it feels very surreal being down here in the bottom of the world and watching the rest of the world go absolutely mad. But it also gives me a sense of hope, and I know you know, for a lot of people, this last election, just this past weekend, I mean, it's seen our first majority government under a mixed member proportional system. So without having to go into the intricate details of that system, it means that it's the first time since 1996 that one political party has the ability to govern alone without any coalition partners. And they may still pick up the Green Party as coalition partners. Those negotiations are happening, I believe. But just the fact that they have a mandate to govern alone gives me a reasonable amount of hope that they can do something quite transformative. I won't go into the politics of it too much, but I mean, they are a reasonably progressive party, and Jacinda Ardern particularly is an incredible leader, as many people will have seen around the world from her response to the Christchurch mosque shootings last year, and just her brand of politics in general, which is much kinder, more compassionate, and doesn't I guess have the same level of rhetoric that we see from a lot of other more strong arm politicians around the world.
Yeah, well, it's certain that we need ethical leaders if we're going to enter into, you know, more promising chapters in our history. Yeah, this is, I mean, I think so much change needs to happen on a local level, you know, bottom up, but we need, you know, those influential people play such a critical role in shaping the big picture.
Yeah, they absolutely do have a role to play, and particularly the leaders. I mean, you know, whether we like it or not, politics is now a game of personality, more so now than ever. And so it is important to have those people who are really walking the talk as the leadership. But I mean, in saying that, after 3 years working in politics, I really came to the realization that systems change is not going to start in politics. Systems change needs to start with, it needs to start with everybody. So politicians will have their role to play. But at the moment, I think a lot of people put them up on a pedestal where they think they're going to solve all of our problems. And as you said, it really does need to start more at the grassroots. It needs a lot, you know, millions and millions of different, yet interconnected efforts happening around the world on many, many different levels.
Yeah, so you describe yourself as a systems thinker. And here at Systems Change Alliance, we talk about connecting the dots, you know, between the different challenges and crises that we're facing, and that we need to have an integrated approach to change. What does being a systems thinker mean to you and in your work?
Yeah, good question. I mean, to me, it means recognizing that everything is interconnected. Every action has a reaction. Anything that you change in one system will have ripple effects. And so in my day-to-day work, that means recognizing that if I'm looking to solve a problem, that I need to think about, well, who else is part of that problem, and what's the system it's embedded within, and what other influences are happening to that system, and what are the ripple effects of those. And so it's really about asking a lot of questions, and getting really down to the why of a problem, and asking more and more. We can almost think of it as concentric circles. If you've got a problem in the middle, you know, looking out to the first circle of like, okay, so what's happening around that problem, and then looking at another circle and saying, well, what are the things that are influencing the thing that's happening with that problem, and really just recognizing that the more different viewpoints and stakeholders and diverse perspectives that you are able to bring into a decision-making process, the better chance you're going to have at actually having eyes across all of the different influencing factors that are contributing to these complex, tricky challenges that the world is facing.
So I guess that also means, the more diverse input you have, then the more you can understand to what extent the needs of different peoples, communities, beings are being met by the systems that are in place.
Yeah, and also just becoming comfortable with complexity and paradox, and trying to get away from this dualistic thinking that we have as human beings, that if there is something that's right, then there must automatically be a wrong, or if there's good, then there's evil, and saying that, seemingly opposingly things could potentially be true at the same time, and that the world is not simple. That these problems are complex, the solutions are complex, and that if we can get away from that dualistic mindset and become a bit more comfortable with ambiguity and become okay with unanswered questions, at least for the meantime, that we'll have a better chance of seeing things that we didn't see before.
And that seems to tie in with your theme of polarization that you address in your poem. There's this idea of black and white thinking, and how that actually keeps us trapped in quite a childish interaction with the world. Yeah,
it does, and I think it stems from childhood. We still haven't really got beyond that hero and villain story. We're always looking for a villain. And I see that quite a lot in a lot of social change or environmental change movements as well, is that we're looking to pinpoint, okay, who can we blame for this? Whether it's, the greedy corporate bankers, or if it's the oil companies or whatever, they are all operating within a system. Yes, we do need to decarbonize and get away from fossil fuels, but we're still all participating in a society and a system that is underpinned by fossil fuel use, and we're still all contributing to that problem. So really, the oil companies are just doing what they do within the capitalist fossil fuel driven society that we live within. And so that's why I think a lot of the change has to come from the ground up. And we don't. There's a fantastic Buckminster Fuller quote that we don't change the existing situation. I forget how it goes, by changing it, but that we build something else that makes the current model obsolete. And that's what we need to do, really, is stop fighting up here and instead be constructing and building something else from the bottom up.
Yeah, I think we need to take a solutions of focused approach. There's no use kind of scrabbling around in the dark, deciding who's to blame, right? Like you say, it's really about looking at what the alternatives are, so that when we really need them, we know what the options are available to us. Yeah.
And remembering, going back to my poem, is that other people who think differently, they think you're to blame. So we're all to blame, right? And no one is to blame, and we are all to blame simultaneously.
Yeah. And given that this year 2020 has been such a massive one in terms of global events and craziness, how has that influenced your creative work?
Yeah, craziness is a good word. It's interesting. I thought, when this whole COVID thing started getting very real and we were being locked down and so on, I thought it would be a great driver of my creativity. But the reality was that, I was at home in an apartment with two preschoolers. I was feeling a fair amount of stress and anxiety about what was happening, and I didn't get a lot of time to do writing, poetry writing and so on. As I said before, we attempted to do a collaborative piece with another poet, but it just didn't quite come together. And so from that standpoint, I wasn't very productive. But I have this year been writing a book about storytelling and narrative and how it can support systems change. And it's very much my own story as well. So it's sort of part memoir rather than being a dry how-to manual. And that has actually been, it's been helped along by a lot of the processes that, the events and circumstances that this year has presented for us. So there's quite a few reflections in there about COVID-19. For a while, I had to remind myself that this wasn't a book about COVID-19 and that I should stop using that as the example all the time. But it certainly has, this year has provided a number of shake-ups to some of the big narratives that underpin our lives. The narratives about us, being separate nations, and the narrative about whose work we value and whose work we don't. We found ourselves suddenly very, very reliant on those low-wage people who are going about their lives and working really hard to provide groceries and drive buses and care for people, the healthcare professionals. Suddenly we were so dependent on them, and we see, grocery clerks and bus drivers and nurses and so on often having to really, really fight for better wages and better working conditions. So that's really shaken up some of our narratives, I feel. And I've drawn on that quite a lot in writing the book. And also some of the narratives around last year's mosque shootings and the way that New Zealand responded to that. It's been really interesting to see how the narrative, the national psyche of New Zealand changed in the wake of those shootings, because it was the first time we had experienced a major terror attack in New Zealand. And I think up until that point, a lot of us had, on some subconscious level at least, we had this idea that this could never happen here, that this was somehow a bit of a safe haven down in the bottom of the world with egalitarian roots, and that we were a nice, happy, multicultural society. And it really shone a light on the fact that actually, no, we do have these problems here, and we have had them for a long time. We have shocking child poverty rates in this country. We have, shocking domestic violence rates. And that there is a lot of problems here that we have to deal with as well. And this narrative that we've been telling ourselves of being this egalitarian society has actually not really been true for quite some time now. But our thinking and our psyche had yet to catch up. So it was really interesting watching last year how that attack really accelerated a lot of those conversations.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a very important point in the country's history, recent history. Yeah. And are there any other creative projects that you're excited about right now, or is the book your main focus?
The book is certainly my main focus at the moment. Yeah, I'm due to get first draft to my editor next week, so it is certainly the number one thing I'm thinking about at the moment. But yeah, beyond the publishing, which I'm hoping for, I'm going to self-publish early next year. So I'll certainly be relying on aligned networks to get the word out and help it get out there. Which was an interesting decision to make. I think just with a book of this kind, I really wanted to keep as much creative control over it as possible, and also I feel like it's reasonably urgent to get this kind of thinking out there, and so I didn't want to go through the process of waiting a year or two for a publisher to do their thing. So beyond that, I think I'll be looking at things like taking some of the content online, perhaps launching some sort of a course, and doing narrative workshops and so on, as well as leaning a bit more into the poetry. So the book has 5 sections, and each one is opened with one of my poems, including the one that I performed earlier. And so my idea at this point is to have QR codes in the book that can link through to video performances of each of those poems as well. And that's a really interesting way for me to reconcile that that feeling that I had inside, that I've always been quite resistant to putting my poetry into print, because as I said earlier, I really think the words are only one small piece of a poem, and I really prefer people to hear or see my poetry rather than read it. So that seemed like an interesting way to be able to say, well, here's a QR code and you can actually see this poem as well while you're reading it. So I've got some recording to do later this year as well. So that'll be quite fun, getting in front of a camera and into a studio. And of course, the audiobook narration will be fun as well, because then I can actually perform the poems aloud, and it will have my own voice.
Yeah, great. So you'll have an audio version as well. That's a good idea. So what would you say, just coming back to this idea of systems change and looking at kind of big picture reality, let's say, what would you say are the 3 systemic changes that the world needs most right now?
Well, the first and the major one is a decarbonisation of our economy. And that needs to happen on a number of levels, as I see it. It needs to happen on the individual choice level, but also needs to happen at a city planning level, really at every level, education, looking at circular economies and how can we be reusing a lot of the resources that we already have instead of getting new ones out. And even around fossil fuels, there's some interesting technologies now around waste gas capture and turning that into ethanols and so on. So leaning into both the technological side of that, but also recognizing that the ways that we live and eat and get around are going to have to change significantly as well. And the second one, I guess related to that, is our global food system. So at the moment, I see that we've got simultaneous problems where, one half of the world is still suffering from hunger and malnutrition, and then another half of the world is suffering from sort of Western world diseases around diabetes and heart disease that largely stem from eating an abundance of over-processed foods, pseudo foods, I kind of call them. So really thinking about how do we relocalize food systems? How do we ensure that the 1/3 roughly of all food that is produced that currently goes to waste doesn't go to waste? Because that's a massive big elephant in the room that people seldom don't talk about, is the fact that we produce this food that then gets wasted, which is just criminal to me. So lots of intertwined pieces of the puzzle there. And then the third one, I think, is rising inequality. So be that on a national level, whether it's looking at racial inequality at the US right now, or in New Zealand, as I said, we have shocking levels of child poverty rates. So there's a rising inequality problem here, and in a lot of the world, really, in that we have this increasing gap between the rich and the poor, and the erosion of the middle class. And that needs to be addressed on a systemic level too, because it happens along racial lines, it happens along geographical lines. It happens along different tiers of education. If you're in one zone and you go to that school, then you've got more of a chance of being poverty and later in life. So really, that's a problem that needs to be addressed on a systemic level as well. And that's what makes it so tricky, of course.
What ideas do you have, or creative ideas, or do you have around how that inequality could be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, the level that I'm always thinking about is story and narrative, right? So for me, that looks like getting real people's stories out there, and helping people to understand what what it actually feels like to be trying to feed a family of 5 or 6 or 7 on welfare payments. What are the day-to-day challenges? And to make sure that if we're telling those stories, that they happen in a way that really is quite thematic and talks about all of the factors that are playing into that. So it could be looking at, the fact that the school is X kilometres away and they need to get 2 buses because the local rural school has closed, or and looking at healthcare access and access to food and local food, or whether they only have access to the cheap stuff at the supermarket. And so really bringing all of those other factors in, rather than just making it like a nice sort of a heartstrings pulling story about these people. There's some fantastic work that has been done. I think the Frameworks Institute have a really good, I think it's called the wide angle lens toolkit, where you can have a look. And it really breaks down the difference between episodic and thematic storytelling. And episodic is just about those people and telling their story. And then the thematic will be about those people telling their story, but then bringing in perhaps statistics, or talking about trends, historical trends, or other contextual information that helps you understand how those people are situated within a system. So I think that's really important, is making sure that we are telling stories, but that we're telling them in such a way that embeds the story within a much wider narrative and a much wider system. And then obviously there's a lot of policy that could change as well.
When you talk about that, I had this kind of image of a map come to mind, with all these different influencing factors that come in from all different strands that make up our lives, right? The different systems that we interact with day to day, and how they influence people. Yeah,
nobody lives in a vacuum, right? But we often try to solve problems as if these problems arose in a vacuum, but they didn't. Everything is interconnected, and if we're going to solve one problem, then we better understand what the underlying causes of that problem, not just the most obvious one.
Yeah, and then we come back to that kind of the antidote to the black and white thinking of having that wide angle lens, that big picture vision that can help us integrate all the different realities into our worldview. Yeah. We actually have a question from someone who's tuned in on Facebook, and Fernando Aranda, and he's asking, Alina, in your opinion, what can art or poetry do in order to move societies to a more sustainable world, and what can it not do? So what are the limitations, and what are the possibilities?
Sure. So what it can do, I think, is paint a picture of what the world could look like, and so that, I mean, there's a lot of focus at the moment on politicians or businesses to forecast what's going to be happening in the future. And if we can reverse that process and say, in 2030 or 2040 or 2050, this is what we want the world to look like, and really using blue sky thinking and in our imaginations to say, this is the narrative of what I would like. That's what I think art can do. And from there, we can sort of work backwards to figure out what are the steps that we need to get there, instead of forecasting what it is that we think the future will look like based on the present and the past, which have not been serving us so well, the present and the past, in terms of big systemic problems. So that's, I think, a really important role that art can play, is helping bring a vision to life of something that isn't at the moment, something that could be. And then, I mean, the limitations, obviously, art can't directly change policy. It can influence the people that make policy, but we still will need, given that we live in a collective world with a lot of diverse viewpoints and different ways about how change goes about, we do need to have some concrete, very objective ways of doing things that everybody can understand, which is where policy comes in. So yeah, I mean, my sense is that we need a lot more art and story. We have traditionally leaned a lot on fact and rationality and trying to, I guess, intellectualize our way into a better future. And that I see is not working. I think what we need to do is paint a better vision of what the future could look like and inspire. Because really, I mean, humans are story-driven creatures. Story is what motivates us. And it is what enables us to see how things could be different. So I think that's where art comes in, is it's really important for helping us get beyond the limitations of our own intellectual thinking.
Yeah, that's great. And interestingly, there's been two projects, artistic creative projects, that I've come across recently that do just what you were talking about, kind of painting a picture of possible future. One is this animation called A Message from the Future #2, which was a project that Naomi Klein was involved in. I don't know if you've watched that, but it's quite an interesting way of kind of casting into the future what a possible path.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard good things about it.
Yeah, definitely worth a watch. It's, thought-provoking. May not be exactly what, everyone's thinking about, but I think there's some really interesting points there. And the other is this film 2040, made by Australian filmmaker Damon Gameau, who actually I'm going to be interviewing in a couple of weeks' time. And that's all about, his looking at how 20 years' time could look if all the best solutions that we have at our disposal were actually put into place. Do you know about that film?
I've seen a trailer for it. Yeah, it looks really good. Is that, I think it's the one where he's it features his children quite a lot. Is that the one?
Yeah, he's writing a letter to his currently 4 or 5-year-old daughter and imagining her as an adult. Yeah,
I've certainly got that one on my list. It looks amazing.
Yeah, so it's really I think you've put your finger on an important point, which is that if we get bogged down in the statistics and the kind of the rationalization of all our different systems, we get a bit stuck, and we don't we aren't then able to visualize where we're going to. We need to be in that creative kind of intuitive right brain flow in order to break out of the boxes that we've put ourselves into.
Yes, and I mean that's not new thinking. I mean, George Lakoff has been talking about that stuff for the past 30 years, really. He takes a political approach, but essentially says that the political right are very good at rallying around a central story and sticking to that story and talking about their family values, and the policy is almost, it's quite secondary. Whereas the political left have traditionally tried to rationalize with people and with this idea that the truth will set you free, and that's simply not how our brains operate. Our brains, our human brains, they latch onto a story much more so than facts and figures, and so that's something that I think the systems change and the progressive movement really needs to double down on, is telling the story of what their ideal version of the world looks like.
Yeah, and I think to also carve this common ground somehow, to leave the divisions of left and right behind in order to actually overcome that polarity.
Yeah, it's not really useful. It's so outdated as far as I can see.
Yeah, well, I think it keeps us trapped in that us and them mentality. And but interestingly, I feel like this year is an excellent example of how narratives, whether kind of benevolent or not, can really, shape our view of the world. It's so strong. People's opinions have become so sharpened by world events, and more than ever, I think we need that uniting story. Yeah,
I think you're right.
So yeah. So before we say goodbye, do you have any words of support, encouragement, inspiration for other artists and writers out there who are finding their voice and making their mark? Anything you'd like to share?
Really, just to, I said it in my poem, you do you. Figure out what it is that you are most passionate about and really work on that. But understand that there are other people that are passionate about something else, and that matters too, even if you don't agree with it. But really, it's about, finding what it is that brings you alive. What is your why, and then telling people about that, talking about that, because there's nothing more inspiring than seeing somebody who is like truly, being the change that they want to be in the world, or that they want to see. And that, I think that has a ripple effect. If we see somebody living their truth and being not afraid to speak out about what it is that they are passionate about and believe in, that inspires others to do so. And that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, thank you. That's very heartfelt and meaningful to me in my life, as well as I'm sure to many people who'll be watching this. Yeah, so thank you so much for your time, Alina. It's been really great to chat with you and hear about your work. And I wish you good luck with getting your first draft of your book away, and hopefully be seeing it in print next year.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very excited about that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, see you later.